Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to my talk. Like many of you, I'm a father. My daughter doesn't believe that anybody actually comes to see me talk, so I'm just going to take some documentary. Can you please wave? Thank you. Now, looking around the audience, a surprisingly large number of you seem to know me already, or I know you, or we've drunk together. So you might be surprised why I am giving this talk, particularly since I spent my entire life in the finance industry, so you might have some doubts about me giving a talk on ethics. I'll just mention poachers and gamekeepers, and yeah. I want to start this talk with a warning. Unlike pretty much every other talk at this conference, this talk is not given by an expert. I'm not a trained philosopher. I'm not an expert on the subject in any way. I do have a black sweater, and I did used to smoke French cigarettes, and I do drink a lot of coffee, so I think I'm moderately qualified. But don't expect to come away having learned anything from this talk. My success criteria for this talk is that you leave this talk full of self-doubt and with nagging questions. If I fail to achieve this, please see me afterwards, and I will try and depress you in suitable ways later. Now, why are we talking about software engineering ethics? Well, because we're software engineers. And that term on its own is fraught with contention. I'm German. If I was in Germany, I think I'd have some legal problems around calling myself an engineer, because I'm not a trained engineer. I don't have a, what do you have to have? A degree in engineering. And I think that kind of highlights a lot of, some of the issues around software and how we as an industry are at the same time responsible for a lot of things without any actual regulation. But hey, at least we're professional software developers. I think we can agree on that, at least in the sense that we get paid for it. So we should really worry about the ethics of what we do. I could have called this talk just engineering ethics, because basically all engineering nowadays involves software. I could have just called it applied ethics, but then nobody would have come. But anyway, I wanted to really focus on the issues of the ethical issues that affect us as a profession, which sounds terribly dull, and it probably is, so if you want to leave the room, I don't blame you. But one thing I'm not going to talk about is this, trolley problems. That kind of gets rolled out every time people talk about self-driving cars, and I think it's a complete waste of time. It's a complete red herring. It is not a problem, right? Self-driving cars will just slow down when it's dangerous, and if they don't, it's just, they don't have to be terribly safe to be safer than the average driver, which is all the mark they have to pass. I'm also not going to be talking about this. So the last time I gave this talk, somebody approached me afterwards and just said, can you read that at the back? Yes.
Come closer. Come closer if
Yes.
not.
So one issue which I kind of explicitly excluded from this talk is talking about aerospace defense and the ethical implications of that, mainly because I don't think they're terribly relevant for most of us. And Tom Lehrer kind of did it for me in the 60s, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. What I will talk about is this. This is a quote from Uncle Bob. I don't know if, is he here this week? I haven't seen him. Okay. So, who knows Uncle Bob? Who has had a beer with Uncle Bob? Okay, right. So we all know this quote from Uncle Bob, right? People in our society, the better helpfully highlighted, interact with software every single second of every day. Slight exaggeration, but basically, without software, nothing works. And I've given a number of talks about this subject because I'm a software engineer. I'm a professional software writer, and I know how bad it is. And this keeps me awake at night. I do not want my life to depend on the code other people have written. I know some of these other people. I have interviewed lots of them. And these people have full-time jobs working on real software that affects real people, and they know nothing. It is deeply worrying, to me at least. But one of the things that people want to briefly draw on is how unregulated the software industry is, right? Basically, anybody can write some software that suddenly affects millions of people. And we can all think of examples like this. I mean, Twitter, for example. I'm a rabid Twitter person. I tweet, and I'm glued to my Twitter feed. Like, nobody assessed the impact of this before they started it, right? Now, compare that with other industries that affect us in our daily lives. Compare that with the finance industry. So I've spent most of my career there. And there's a lot of debate about whether the regulation in the finance industry makes any sense, whether it's effective. And there's good reason to believe that it isn't very effective and is very badly applied, but it is there, right? Similarly, I'd like to, if you haven't read this book yet, I'd highly recommend it. It is the single scariest book I've ever read. And I'm including 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale and all those things, because this is based on facts, right? This is another industry which is very, very heavily regulated and still has lots of problems. All I'm trying to say is, in comparison, our industry, without any regulation at all, affects people even more than the pharma industry or the finance industry. So, bearing this in mind, I'm not the first person to think about the ethical implications of software. In fact, the IEEE and the ACM both have ethics codes. So do we have any IEEE or ACM members here? No? Okay.
BCS has a code as well.
Do you?
BCS has a code as well.
Okay, good point. I have to confess, I completely ignore the BCS on the ground that I've not found it to have any relevance to my life whatsoever, ever. But I should know the ethics code given this talk. So the ethics code is fantastic. Yeah, this is a fantastic document, right? It has a preamble. I like documents with preambles. I think a preamble lends a document a certain requirement, gravitas, right? So next time I'm writing a requirements document, I'm going to start with a preamble. Whereas, on this day, we have convened to, something like that. It'll just, spice up the stand-up meetings. The other thing that really appeals to me, where is it? Oh yes, there's sections, and somewhere in here, I can't see it right now, it talks about versioning of this code, which is good. I like people who think about versioning of documents before they put them out. So this is a very good document. The trouble is nobody reads these things, right? I mean, I like preambles, but to be fair to the average coder, you look at a preamble and you probably go, TLDR, done. So, where was I? Sorry, my speaker notes are too big for what I've said. Okay. Another document that's slightly shorter, doesn't have a preamble, which you might be familiar with, is this Programmer's Oath, and this is a really interesting document. Particularly because it talks about kind of practices that we do for us. It really doesn't mention ethics very much at all. It kind of, this is the only bit of ethics it deals with. And I kind of think that deliberately producing harmful code is kind of it's the obvious thing about when you talk about ethics, right? But who here has, it's like nobody wants to deliberately produce harmful code. Well, some people might, but very few people will admit to that in public. And that's kind of all it talks about. It really doesn't get to the grips of the implications of software on the world. So, yeah, that's what I have to say about that. I'm not a mathematician. I work with mathematicians, so I have a formalism envy, and I like to smuggle Greek letters into my presentations at every opportunity. So this is all right here. Moral virtue. If you agree, if you know, does anybody know Greek? If you do, this is probably nonsense, but this is what Google Translate tells me. And I really wanted to think about kind of duty. I think this is a lovely word and it has lots of implications, or it ties into lots of thinking we've been doing over the last few decades in terms of, the quality and patterns and all that kind of stuff. So that's why it's a lovely word. The bit I wanted to focus on here is, well, moral virtue and duty. I think duty is kind of the framework I use to think about these things. So we have a set of duties. Now, I kind of, just to, as I said, I'm not a trained philosopher. I like simple things, right? So the way I think about duty is in terms of circles of duty. There's two things in this. Somebody who does something, well, an actor and a subject to whom you owe a duty. Sounds a bit abstract. Let's start with the obvious one. As a room full of professional software developers, we have duties towards the people that pay us. Now, that seems pretty obvious. You're supposed to show up and do your work on time. But I think it goes beyond that, right? I mean, as we all know, people don't necessarily know what they want, or people don't think with the same perspective about software that we do. So people will say, I want this done by tomorrow, and you say, well, I can give you this shitty version by tomorrow, or I can give you a real version in 2 weeks' time that actually works and is going to continue working. So I think our duty to our clients is both very obvious, but needs to be thought out a little bit deeper. So we have a duty to help them. If you think about it as an interaction between people who are expert in their field, so people who, traders who know finance, and an expert in our field, we know about software, we have a duty to actually guide them in their choices, right? So that's just the obvious one I wanted to talk about. Now, there's another circle. Your colleagues. Now, this is kind of a lot of what the programmer's oath talks about, right? So the programmer's oath, if you remember that back, talks a lot about the stuff we have to do, or the duties we have towards our colleagues. We have a duty to our colleagues to build maintainable software to make their job easier in the future. We have duties to do testing. We do have duties to develop things. I think it goes a little beyond that. Where is Andy? Andy isn't here. Good. The lovely lightning talk yesterday about the boy with a ZX Spectrum. I'm a middle-aged white guy. I'm not the guy to talk about diversity. But I'm here, so I'm talking about it. So we have a lot of other responsibilities towards our colleagues. We have a responsibility, actually, coming back to our responsibility to our client, right? We have a responsibility to our client to build the best team we can, or the most effective team we can, and diversity. This cracked me up. So apparently, the best way to make a team smarter is to have women in it, or have more women in it. You don't look convinced. I just find an amusing story. And actually, let's gloss over the diversity stuff because other people have covered that much better. But I just think we need to look at the diversity stuff and think about who we hire, how we can come up with hiring practices that are effective but inclusive. And I just wanted to raise that with you guys. And it's nice. It's kind of nice to see that people are actually thinking about this now, apart from me. And yeah. Okay. So let's move on to our favorite people, users. What are our duties to our users? Now, in the case where your clients and your users are the same people, the people that pay you are the people that use the software. That's great. That's a very simple problem to solve because they're interesting to say. That is quite a rare occurrence, I think. Most of the time, your users and your clients are different people, and that leads to problems like this one, where the people that pay you will actually do something or want you to do something that's deliberately not in the interest of your users. In fact, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry of internet advertising which kind of works against the interests of your users generally. Some might say, I mean, I don't know, if anybody works in internet advertising, I apologize, I didn't mean to offend you. So a slightly more extreme example is this one. So, you know, somebody is paid to write a deliberately misleading advert or advertorial for drugs. Now, this is in the US, and therefore they can get away with it. In the UK or anywhere else in Europe, that would be illegal. It'd be illegal even if it wasn't misleading, because you can't advertise drugs to consumers directly here. But one of the other things that I kind of wanted to talk about is that we don't understand our users, right? So it's very difficult for us to write software that works for users if we don't understand their actual needs, and we have to be very careful in analyzing the actual needs of our users and analyzing the constraints. I didn't put the slide in, but I've seen some research which shows that essentially, you know, some ludicrous number of users, like 70–80% of people, can't use a computer in the way that you'd expect them to be able to. Right? They can't perform even what to us would be trivial tasks on a computer. And if we don't think about that, if we don't think about the usability of our software in this way, then we're failing our users, and we're failing our duty to our users. So the other kind of thing is you know, is it ethical for us to use data that's not necessarily legally obtained, but obtained in dubious ways, right? Are we allowed to snoop on our users? Our clients might, for example, you know, if you're writing some in-line of business application, our clients might well ask us to put some monitoring in to monitor the productivity of the users. Is that an ethical thing for us to necessarily do? I mean, after all, they're there to do a job and blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I don't have any answers for this. I just wanted to put out the question that we need to think about the implications of our action, right? Every time we capture and store some data, you kind of have to think about what's going to happen to that data afterwards. How safe is it? Is it secure? Could that be used against the interests of the people that we write the software for? So, have I sown any self-doubt and confusion yet? A little bit? Good. Oh, that's the skill. Sorry, I did put the slide in. So, yeah, this is really interesting. I urge you to read that. Let's move on to a completely different thing that people don't really necessarily think about very often. So you also have a duty, not just to your clients, your users, your employers, but also to your family, right? And that is, I think, is sometimes overlooked. You know, if you're in London in the tech scene, it's very easy to get into well, there's at least one startup guy that I can see there. You know, the sort of 24-hour working, then go to a meetup with pizza and beer. It's just something you should bear in mind, right? Obviously you have a duty to feed your family and to maybe provide shelter for them, but you also have a duty to look after yourself. You have a duty to spend time with your family, and that's kind of not something people think about when they're thinking about software, right? And it's just something I'd like to raise as something for you to ponder in your spare time. And obviously then, if you have these different overlapping circles, and I apologize for the terrible drawing, there are conflicts, right? So, yeah, you have a clear-cut duty to your client, you have a clear-cut duty to your colleagues. What if your client wants you to do something that's unethical or illegal? You still have to pay the mortgage, right? What are you going to do? There's a conflict there, and that's kind of something we have to think about. That was that. Next one. If you haven't noticed, this diagram is not only terrible, it's also not to scale. So we have a duty to society. I was going to put a slide with a Thatcher quote in here because there is such a thing as society, but I thought that would get me booed off stage. The key thing to remember when it comes to society is that obviously, okay, she was slightly, her quote was slightly taken out of context. The key thing about that quote was really that people are responsible for their actions and the consequences of their action. Intended or unintended. So let's look at the simple ones first. Let's look at intended consequences. So this is about the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal. And this is how it was reported on the BBC. And the first thing that struck me as a software engineer, that's just bollocks, right? This defeat device was not a sophisticated piece of kit. It's a couple of if statements. That's the first thing I thought about this. Yeah, the other thing that I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I'd love to catch up on the German press coverage about it afterwards. But is everybody familiar with the Dieselgate scandal? Okay, so I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think I was trying to place myself in the organization and be like a fly on the wall for the project planning meeting, right? Can you imagine that there's a project planning meeting, there's a kickoff meeting, and they say, okay, key features for engine management software, improve, reduce diesel consumption by 10% to the previous version, run more efficiently, easier to upgrade, increase the test coverage, and defeat the, change the emissions when we're on a test stand. That must have been on the fucking project plan at some point, right? Somebody must have put that on there. And like the next slide I have is about Uber, which everybody knows is a slightly dodgy company. But this is Volkswagen, right? I kind of imagine that Volkswagen is a solid engineering company, and yet somebody put on the project plan, defeat the emissions test as a line item. And this went through, this wasn't like a guy that just did it, with a sort of stereotypical BBC hacker picture, with a hoodie and sneakily putting that in. No, this was actually a project plan to deliberately, A, lie to the regulator, and B, poison the environment. Clearly they should have come to my ethics talk first.
I'm curious about whether the people at Volkswagen knew the regulations. The programmer should know that you're breaking the regulations, you have to know the regulations. And if it was on the project planners, optimize performance under these conditions, you might not necessarily know that you are programming something that will ultimately cause those regulations to be broken. I have no idea what happened.
Yeah, good point. I'm pretty confident that the people who write the engine management software are familiar with the regulations about diesel emissions because that's their working framework, right? Okay, I could see how you could phrase it differently. But still, somebody must have at some point thought about this and thought, does this make sense? Is this a good thing to do? And it still went through. So I find this quite weird. So I was kind of picturing myself as like in the daily stand-up meeting, going like, held up on the engine defeat, on the test defeat device. Anyway, there's more extreme examples, right? So this grey ball thing, I like to pick on Uber. So basically, grey ball was a software technology that they developed to identify users that were law enforcement and try to control Uber's, the way Uber was running, and then it denied them access to their network, which is kind of a really bizarre thing. So this is kind of what it does. And again, you're kind of thinking, how, to pick up that phrase, how was that phrased in the software development process as a legitimate target or as a legitimate goal for your software to achieve? Let's ban law enforcement people from checking our software. I mean, the closest thing I could have, from the finance industry, the equivalent would be, I don't know, we'll have a special database where we don't report the trades from. And if you walked into a bank, and if a managing director came to anybody in a bank and said, we're going to build this special database for special trades that we're not going to trade report because they're illegal, you might say, yes, boss, and then you'd go straight on the hotline to the Financial Conduct Authority. Yes? Yes. Mm. I think absolutely, and this is kind of why I'm worried about the ethics of software development companies, right? Because there isn't any regulation. I personally don't think that having a regulated profession is going to work for software for any number of reasons. At what point do you become a software developer? When you write an Excel spreadsheet? When you add VBA to your Excel spreadsheet? Or what are you going to do? You're going to ban 10-year-olds from coding on their Raspberry Pi until they've passed a formal certification exam? It's just not going to work. But at the same time, we have a problem like you just mentioned, right? Where there isn't the culture to think about whether what you're doing is safe, legal, ethical, and that's a problem. And obviously, you came to this talk, you obviously have an interest, so I'm preaching to the choir here, but we kind of need to talk about, get this out more, and that is what I'm trying to achieve here badly. So this is just about the kind of, so this is one aspect of where software has been used to kind of avoid the law or negate the law or do something illegal. There's another side to this, which if anybody came to my talk last year, you'll know about him. If you've ever read a newspaper, you might know about him as well. He's also been featured on the internet once or twice. If you know me, I gave a talk about this last year about surveillance. People have different views about this. My views are fairly obvious. But there are a bunch of people working in Cheltenham who are writing software that logs your internet access. Is that ethical? There's a long discussion about trade-offs and so forth. Yeah, and we can have that in, well, I don't know. I personally think it isn't. It's ineffective and it's unethical. It is particularly unethical because it's ineffective, if you see my drift. But let's move on. So that was the intended consequences. Now we have unintended consequences as well. And this is very depressing. So if you think about the history of mankind and technological progress, it's basically 20,000 years of unintended consequences, right? Every single time we've come up with a new technology, it's had, it's basically gone and screwed up everything else in the process, right? So start off with something benevolent like shipbuilding, right? People, when the Greeks discovered how to build, sea-going ships out of nice long timbers, what did that lead to? Well, lots of wars, the deforestation of the Greek islands, climate change, all sorts of things. And, and I think the blaming people for unintended consequences is a little bit unfair because obviously you didn't intend to, do this thing. It just sort of, you did something else, and as a result, it happens. And from a legal perspective, there is, in fact, a big difference between, manslaughter and murder. There's a good reason for that. Obviously, from the victim's perspective, it's rather irrelevant to make those fine distinctions. Therefore, I think we really need to think about the unintended consequences and see what happened as a result of our actions. Talking about contentious quotes, I love this quote. How old is the guy now? He must be in his 80s. This is possibly the only sensible thing he's ever said in his life. almost certainly the only thing he ever said that I agree with. Um, yeah, and there's see, at this point, it would be lovely to actually be a trained philosopher, because then I could talk to you about epistemology and all those things, but I'm not, so we'll have to skip that. I did want to go back to talking about self-driving cars. And I think this is the real problem with self-driving cars. This is the whether it's an unintended consequences or intended consequences is open to debate. But what should we worry about when we worry about self-driving cars? We shouldn't worry whether they take the left or the right track on the trolley problem. We should worry about the fact that they're going to put millions of people out of work, right? At the moment, becoming a driver, a taxi driver, a minicab driver, a lorry driver, is kind of the default option for a certain class of people that have no other qualifications, right? Pretty much anybody can do this job, and there are millions of people working in that industry, all of whom are going to lose their job if self-driving cars actually take off. Whose fault is that? Well, it's who bears responsibility for that? Well, I'm all for tinkering with neural networks and deep learning and GPUs, and it's really cool. But this is what's going to happen as a result, and we kind of have to, well, it would be nice if, for once in the history of human evolution, we've addressed the unintended consequences before rather than after we created a problem. So that was that. That's somebody who kind of sums up my sentiments on this. There are other unintended consequences. Now, the one about self-driving cars, I mean, that's fairly easy to predict, and I think we might have a chance to actually look at resolving that before it becomes too much of a problem. There are other unintended consequences that are going to be harder to address. Now, social media. Social media is essentially unintended consequences distilled to its purest essence. So what has social media given us, right? Social media has given us a great way of keeping in touch with people, of connecting with remote friends, staying in touch with school friends despite moving countries, great. What it's primarily given us is this. Oop. Yes, fake news. And this has had, a number of bad consequences. This is an ACCU talk, so I'm not going to get too political. Trump. Interestingly enough, it's also worth pointing out that Britain is a world leader in this area, right? Everybody else has just discovered fake news as if it's like a new thing. We've been doing it for decades, right? This is the Daily Mail from 1936 or something. We've been world leaders in fake news for centuries. It's not much of an export success, though, so unlike our jam, oddly enough. Now, this newspaper causes me a lot of agony. For some reason, it's lying on our, I don't know, we get it at the office, and I find it offensive. So every time I come in, I just pick it up and drop it straight into the recycling. So that at least something useful comes out of it. I was looking for other pictures apart from this famous one. And there's a lovely one, which I encourage you to Google, where Viscount Rothermere, wrote a personal letter to his Führer, which tells you basically everything you need to know about the Daily Mail and fake news. But I found this one, and this one has cracked me up, if you can read that. This is the Daily Mail is accusing somebody else of hypocrisy. Yeah. They are the experts at that, thank you, yes. Moving on from the Daily Mail, I do like to bash the Daily Mail. Of course, the fake news thing isn't a new phenomenon. This is from Jonathan Swift about political lying. I'll just leave you to read that for a second. Jonathan Swift was a great guy. We miss him. We could do with him at the moment. any similarity to living politicians is, of course, entirely accidental here. And I mean, kind of, we have to bear in mind that, you know, lying in politics has been around a long time. You know, people have lied since we've started speaking. People, well, possibly even before that. I think there's some research that shows about some apes that deliberately point their colleagues into the other direction for food sources under certain circumstances. So that, anyway, so we're lying a lot. I think what's changed is technology. You know, 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, you know, how did people get the news? Everybody got the same news, right? They, you know, like, I remember when there was like one channel on television or two channels on television, and there was one set of news, and they basically came out the same. And okay, there were newspapers, but they kind of all had a very broad, you know, they might have a slightly different perspective, but at least they reported the same news, right? I mean, whether you pick up the Guardian or the Times, it would have given you the same news with a slightly different perspective, but still broadly the same news. Now, how do we get our news? I know I get most of my news via Twitter. And that's quite a problem, because obviously, who do I follow on Twitter? I follow him, for starters. And he's a fucking liberal, communist Ramono, right? And this nicely ties into the confirmation bias. You can see I'm up to date with my slide. I literally put this in a few hours ago. This is how fresh this talk is. I'm responding to news. But, okay, so we all love our confirmation bias, and we see them everywhere. The point I'm trying to make is that, obviously, I think this is an unintended consequence of our software, right? Whose fault is this? It's our fault. Well, our fault as a profession. And I think, you know, it's okay to get most of your news from Twitter as long as you occasionally read the BBC or... what's very interesting, actually, is if you compare the news from different countries. I highly recommend that as an exercise, right? So read the news about Brexit in the British press, and then go and read Der Spiegel. Helpfully, there's an English edition of it as well, so you can read it without the help of Google Translate. Or be adventurous, try Libération, or any other of the French papers. You know, that's interesting. But of course, it's nice. It's easy enough for me to stay here, to stand here and say, you know, as a member of the liberal metropolitan elite, as an educated person, I'm perfectly capable of handling my confirmation bias and dealing with this, and that is probably not true. But, you know, of course, it's not just confirmation bias and selective reading that we have to worry about. There's also people deliberately spreading lies on social media. You look shocked. You didn't think about this before. This one really upset me a lot. So I'm going to flick past it very quickly on this. So basically, it's an ugly picture. So basically, there was a story, a completely made-up story about, you know, asylum seekers attacking somebody in Sweden, and they used a fake picture of a dog attack. Yeah, sorry. This is. I much prefer this slide to the previous slide. That's why I showed it twice. So the question is, how do we deal with this? How do we counteract the negative effects, the unintended consequences of our software? Social media is a difficult thing to control, and I'm not necessarily sure it's possibly a good idea to control it. I mean, we don't want to live in a world. Well, I don't. We don't want to live in a world where the government decides what news you get. I mean, that's the obvious way of stopping this, is to just say, done, North Korea, there's one version of the truth, and you're going to get it that way. I know in Germany they have, bless you, they have much tighter press regulation. So a German newspaper wouldn't be able to get away with repeatedly publishing utter falsehoods. on their front page without some repercussions, I believe. At least they have to print a... there are also certain things that you're not allowed to say in Germany, right? Where the continental approach to free speech is somewhat different from the Anglo-Saxon approach. In Germany, you're not allowed to deny the Holocaust. If you do, in public, you will be prosecuted. Same in France, I believe. Right? Was it?
From Belgium. Yes,
Belgium.
Belgium.
Sorry, I've been in England too long. All the foreigners look the same to me. Continental speaks French, must be. So there you go. This is the big the take-home message from my talk. We have a big problem, and I have no solutions. Yes.
One of those talking about fake news, the word is crystallizing out the fact it's fake news. So perhaps before we've got a bit comfortable, but now we've got that word out there, it's like bringing it much more to the fore that we've got to be skeptical about what you're doing. So
Yes.
that phrase being out there and people being much more skeptical, that's like part of the way to attack fake news, just the label.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. That's, yes, it works both ways, right? So, yes, it's important that people are now aware of this problem because before they didn't really think about it. But of course, it's being used the other way around as well, right? So, just to pick a random example out of nowhere, Brexit. You know, whenever somebody points out that, you know, leaving the European Union might have several unpleasant consequences, like leaving the European Union for starters, or how, you know, denying the freedom of movement to people coming here also implies that you deny the freedom of movement to people going elsewhere within Europe, and how really or how the fact that, you know, what was it, 10 to 15% of our NHS staff are foreigners from the European Union, and if we make it unpleasant for them, they'll go home, and that'll really help the NHS so much. You know, all those things get. I mean, the fake news thing is. It would be lovely if people actually thought about the news they're reading. And just to throw in a Latin phrase, cui bono, right? It's always who benefits. That you know, that's kind of the. You really, people aren't cynical enough. You have to go through life being a very cynical person. And whenever you read a news story, you say, well, who published that? Why did they publish it? What are they trying to achieve by publishing that story? But people don't do that. But what people do is attach the fake news label to things that are actually true, right? So just as there's a really interesting guy who's crowdfunding journalism, and he's just gone to Malmo. So Malmo, after achieved quite undeserved fame after I think Trump labeled it the rape capital of Europe, and so this guy has gone over there and, you know, actually done some real research on the crime statistics of Malmo, and unsurprisingly, it turns out that Malmo isn't, you know, like Mogadishu. I have been to Malmo. It is a very pleasant, small-ish town in the south of Sweden. And it's not, you know, it's not like a war zone. There's no crime wave going on. But obviously people are labeling that as fake news as well. And so just calling it fake news doesn't address the fundamental issue. And, sorry. If we think back about the, my computer's frozen, that's nice. About the Wikipedia thing, it's fortuitous, I wasn't expecting that slide to still be there. You know, this is Jimmy Wales actually trying to work against fake news by setting up a fact-checking service, right? So when people say blah, 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 and you go like, actually, you know, 15 major newspapers say it's the opposite of what you just said. And I mean, we're kind of at the very beginning of the movement to counter that. And I mean, only time will tell if these things actually work. Coming back to the Daily Mail, I think it's very difficult to to spread, to counter to counter the constant drip of propaganda from a newspaper without circulation. It's also, Facebook is doing a lot of stuff in terms of trying to fact check things. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I think we really have to think about this in the future. So which takes us to kind of the good news and the bad news about the internet, which is that. Now, I'm really hoping for a lot of questions, maybe some suggestions. I don't have any solutions to these problems. I hope some of you might be thinking about solutions to this problem. And I wanted to finish on a slightly more positive note, though. Yeah, that cheered me up a little bit. I mean, we have this technology. We actually have the power to improve things if we try. And I think you were quite right. The first thing to addressing a problem is realizing it exists and, accepting that it's a problem. And yes, so as a profession, we have great power. We need to accept our responsibility. Thank you.